welcome to this third seminar from the Complex Healthcare Processes Research Group. This one is hosted by the Cancer Survivorship and End of Life Care team, and my name is Claire Foster and I'll be chairing this afternoon. We have a packed and exciting programme, and so we're going to make a start. The plan is to hear from two speakers, Richard Wagland and Carol Rivas, Senior Research Fellows from the Faculty of Health Sciences. And then delighted that we have our external speaker, Professor Clive Seal, who will be talking third on the programme. And then we're going to hold questions to the end because we would like to have a panel discussion. So I will be keeping everyone to time. But we have an exciting programme to find out about how to analyse large amounts of narrative text for healthcare service improvement. So first I'd like to introduce Dr. Richard Wagland, who will be talking about mining for the text gold, making big data sets manageable.
Thanks. I find my notes have been moved. Thanks. It's not a good start. Okay, this is entitled Mining for the Text Gold, Making Large Data Sets Manageable. So what I'm going to be doing is just talking about what text mining is generally, and a particular technique that we used in one of our particular studies, and by doing so illustrate some of the strengths and advantages of using text mining, but also some of the limitations of it as well. So the background to our use of text mining techniques is really the increasing recognition that patient-reported outcome data is important for benchmarking, for measuring and improving patient care. And with that, there has been an increase of late of the use of national PROMs, patient-reported outcome measures, and the Cancer Patient Experience Survey, the CPES, which is now run every year now since 2010. I think it's about 4 or 5 times it's been done. So what these produce is very large amounts of data, of course. There's a lot of closed questions, tick box questions, which are part of these surveys, but also free text comments are also added to them as well. So there's an opportunity for patients or survey respondents to add comments to what they're being asked by the survey designers. Not everything a patient wants to say can be encapsulated into one tick box. So open-ended free text questions complement and also contextualise some of the data that's provided by their tick box questions, responses as well. But with large amounts of data, there are of course problems with limitations as far as analysing it. So there's resource and temporal limitations with free text data because, of course, it takes a very long time to read thousands and thousands of comments. With these limitations, there are also real-time relevance of findings can also be limited because if it takes a long time to analyse the data that's been provided by participants, then by the time it's being made available, it is maybe perhaps less relevant. So there was a need for us to produce a automated or semi-automated systematic process really of identifying and managing the data before we can analyse it. We've analysed free text data in 4 studies, funded studies at the moment, so far. The first one was the BJM Open publication, which was a pilot PROM. It was run in 2012 with 4 different sample groups of cancer patients. This was built upon the National Cancer Survivorship Initiative. There was then we did a colorectal survey PROM, which asked everybody who was 12 to 36 months post-diagnosis in the country to respond. There was 22,000 responses to that. And we've also completed a couple of other studies. One was funded by the CUP Foundation, Cancer of Unknown Primary, where we looked at longitudinal data from the CPES for one particular tumour type, Cancer of Unknown Primary, the first time that's been done, and also with the Welsh CPES data in 2013, and that was the first time a national analysis has been done of CPES free text comments. But I'm going to be talking a little bit about the colorectal study because that's the one where we devised this particular technique that we used. So what is text mining? Text mining is simply the identification and retrieval of comments on specific themes from a very much larger data set. It's previously been used in sort of big online social media data, and we use a selection of algorithms to identify the comments within it. Algorithms are sequential sets of rules which identify semantic and grammatical patterns in text. And they're supervised because what we do initially is to present those algorithms with a pre-coded sample of comments, which already classified comments from the same overall data set. And that is then, from that, the algorithms themselves learn how to go away and look for the same or similar comments in the larger data set. And then we can retrieve them and analyze them for our own purposes. So each algorithm looks for or searches for comments in different ways. It has a different method of looking for the semantic and grammatical patterns within text. So what we need to do before we can do any text mining, use the algorithms, is to develop a coding framework, and that has to be developed from the data set that we have. And that is then used to train and test the effectiveness of the algorithms before we then run them. And for this study we used an R-Text Tools package from R software, which supplies 9 sort of pre-written algorithms. So in a diagrammatic way, just to identify, this is what we call as a text mining assisted qualitative analysis, because essentially what we wanted to do was do a qualitative analysis of the comments that we're particularly interested in looking at, and not discard, but just simply not bother having to read everything that's there. And so there's the development of a thematic framework. So from the comments that we had in the colorectal study, there was 22,000 people responded. Of them, a quarter actually provided comments to the survey. And then we found that within the 4 studies that we did, it's a relatively consistent proportion. Between a half and a third of people who complete surveys will put comments in the free text box. The second phase, so the first phase is development of the thematic framework, which is used to train and test the algorithms. The second phase is the application of those, identification of the comments that you want to look at and retrieve them, and then there's the qualitative analysis of those comments that are released. And that's where you'd normally be starting, I suppose, with a qualitative analysis. This process does the heavy lifting. It moves, it collects the stuff that you want to look at out of the rest of it. Now this is the framework, the thematic framework that we developed, and it was adapted from a earlier study which we used, which we comprehensively coded all comments in the pilot PROM study. So this is kind of an abridged version of it, but we were looking specifically in the colorectal study for experience of care, perceptions of patients' perceptions of their experience of care. So here we have 3 themes: experience of cancer diagnosis and treatment, preparation of patients by services, and experiences of post-treatment care. And then each of these, there were positive or negative categories, and within each of those categories there were subcategories which would then describe, explain those particular issues which people found either positive or negative. That then informs the algorithms before they can, for them to retrieve the comments that you want to look at. Now, as far as the effectiveness of the algorithms are concerned, they are, you can measure them by 3 things. Recall essentially is, and as I said, each algorithm identifies comments in different ways. So you can recall is really the number of true positives that are actually in the data set, the larger data set, the number of real comments, how many of them can be pulled by the algorithms. The precision, i.e. the true positives, how accurate basically are they? How many of the comments that are actually retrieved are really about whatever it is, whatever the category you're looking at. And then the F-score is an overall measurement, which is a harmonic mean of recall and precision. The algorithms themselves, how effective they are, is really also a function of the size of the training set, because obviously the more comments you have in a training set to teach the algorithms, the more likely they are, the more effective they're going to be. And the quality of the data that you are looking at or trying to retrieve comments from. And what I mean by that is how easy or difficult it is for these algorithms to identify them as being part. So, for instance, in the colorectal study we had, there was categories about clinical nurse specialists or GPs, which are very easy to identify comments about this because there's only a certain number of ways that you can describe a GP or a clinical nurse specialist. And then on the other side there are much more what is being called like fuzzy terminology that might be used, broader terminology used for things like sort of emotional problems that people have or the support they get for emotional difficulties. So there's issues about this, and so each of these, different algorithms will find more or less comments in different categories depending upon these issues. We do an ensemble of comments, basically a number of algorithms to collect as many comments as possible. These are the algorithms that we used. If you see, the SVM is the one that was most precise and sensitive. It had the highest HEV score. But if you looked at those 7 algorithms, there were 313 comments out of the 6,000 we had that were actually identified by all of those. And then there was about 3,000 that were which were identified by at least one of those algorithms. So you've got quite a lot there, or quite a little. So what we had to do is make a pragmatic decision and go for the 4 most best performing, which we did, and we got about 1,688 comments to look at. Now, I've got 22,000 survey participants, a quarter of them left comments. Of the experience comments, and this is another thing we found fairly consistent amongst all the studies we did, roughly a third are negative and roughly 2/3 were positive. Now, we did t-test comparisons with the EQ5D score that patients indicated. Within the surveys there was a health-related quality of life score measure called the EQ5D, and you can make a summary score of that to determine how well somebody feels that they are, how well they're doing. And we compared this with the with whether or not patients reported positive or negative comments in the text boxes. We found that for all survey respondents who left comments, there was 0.78 was the EQ5D's mean EQ5D score. For positive it was higher, 0.85. For negative it was lower, 0.74, and this was statistically significant. So basically we have, and these associations were also, there were other subcategories where the mean EQ5D score was statistically significant, the correlation between the two. Timely diagnosis, good post-treatment care, delayed care, pleasant experiences, and inadequate post-treatment care. So essentially there is that connection between whether or not somebody reports good or bad experiences of care with whether or not they have a higher or a lower health-related quality of life. Given this finding, and given that we had retrieved these comments about experience, we then were able to devise a tentative model from the comments that we then analysed. And this is the sort of the qualitative analysis of the comments that are retrieved. The heavy lifting's done, we've got the comments that we're interested in, and then we can then use it to do some theory building that you would normally do with qualitative analysis. And essentially what patients were saying was that, and these are the problems that they are having, the challenges to their health, challenges to their quality of life, are the kind of, not circle, but the square in the middle. So the emotional impact, social and financial issues, physical, emotional problems that people generally face when they're having cancer. And then on the green part of the triangle, there are elements of good experiences of care. And then on the green or orange, it's orange, isn't it? I'm colourblind. There are negative sort of treatments or poor quality of care experienced. And our care actually addressed those health-related quality of life issues, depended or determined whether or not they had good or poor, bad experiences of care. I think that came out right. So to summarise, text mining, the method facilitates resource and time-efficient analysis, especially compared with what we call the conventional gold standard analysis, a comprehensive qualitative analysis of text. It can be used to identify specific comments of specific interest, and it's also, of course, transferable in any other similar kind of survey. But then, having used this method, we also realise there are some limitations to it. It does require a manual analysis of a large enough data set to make those algorithms effective. It also has difficulties with some types of comment categories over others. Not all the relevant comments are going to be necessarily pulled from any kind of large data set. You never know unless you qualitatively analyse the entire set. And also there is a lack of control because these algorithms are pre-written and they work as a kind of a black box. You don't know exactly what's going on. You can't rewrite it or change it. All you know is how effective it is at collecting comments within that data set. So that is me, thank you. And I'll just leave with the acknowledgements who have all the people who've been working on these studies. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. So if you have any questions, if you could make a note of them and hold them until we have the panel discussion at the end. I should have mentioned that there is a Twitter feed, which if you can't see it, it's over there. It's hashtag TextAnalytics2016. So if you want to tweet during the event, then please do so. And also, if you could mention at Health Sciences, which is at HSciences, that would be very welcome. So without further ado, I will hand over to our second speaker, Dr. Carol Rivas, who is going to tell us about looking at large volumes of text in her PRESENT study.
Okay, so as Claire said, I'm going to talk about a study that I'm leading on called PRESENT. And Richard's very nicely summarised the issues around text mining. And so this study leads on from the work that he and his team have done. But instead of using text mining, the plan is to use something called text engineering, which should address those four main issues that Richard listed on his last slide. And he's kindly put the study in context as well, so I don't need to go into the need for analyses of these free text comments, I hope. The main aim of our study has been really well encapsulated by Macmillan in their own statement that they want to use the cancer patient experience survey data to drive improvement. And this is a core ethos of the PRESENT study. We're not simply analysing free text, we're also trying to make sure that it will be useful in driving service improvements. So the way we're going to do that, we're going to use text engineering to try and do a similar thematic analysis to the analysis that Richard described of the CPES, the Cancer Patient Experience Survey, free text comments. And the text engineering process should be rapid and automated when we've finished developing it. And we're also going to develop a website dashboard. So the data analysis that we're going to do is going to feed into a dashboard that users can interact with to get more information from. And overridingly, we are trying to develop a pragmatic and useful system. So the first thing is text engineering. What is it and why we're using it? Well, why we're using it, as I say, it relates to the issues with text mining. Text engineering has been used worldwide in biomedicine for a couple of decades now. It's typically used to cluster genes or to sorry, I'm being put off by two of my colleagues laughing, and I'll come to the explanation of why in a second. And it's also often used to trawl through medical record text to cluster diagnoses symptoms. And one of my students, who's sitting here somewhere, Eva, she sent me this article which describes this sort of process of trawling through the medical records. But interestingly, this article describes text mining, the process that Richard used, which is why my colleagues are having a little laugh there, because I think they thought I was going to say it's text engineering. But this illustrates the confusion that there is. So both of these processes are often called artificial intelligence, and again, I think some of my colleagues here would argue that it is not artificial intelligence. They're very much confused in the literature, and sometimes the names are used synonymously, and I'm just highlighting that because if you go away and look up text engineering, you will probably find an article on text mining instead. Very, very confusing. So the next couple of slides were going to be done by Don Cruikshank, who unfortunately is ill and unable to come. He did do some audios, but they're not working. So I'm going to talk over them, and I might look at his notes as well. So basically, to do our text engineering, we're using open source software called Gate. And you can see at the bottom that Gate runs a number of modules. These represent the algorithms, really, that Richard was talking about, if you want. So I suppose I'd call them subroutines, and I'm sure that's the wrong term as well. But they run in parallel and in sequence, and they develop the text analysis process. And one aspect of the system is that it can feedback as well, so it can develop the process as it goes along automatically without anyone having to supervise it all the way through. I probably haven't explained that well enough, so I'm going to explain that a little bit better in a minute. But you can see at the top of the screen there are different tasks, if you want, that you can click on, and they're related to natural language processing tasks. So you can select particular tasks if you want, or you can have this routine at the bottom, the system at the bottom, running underneath, doing an analysis. Let's see what Don actually calls it. He says you can have it running as a background task that can be installed as part of a web server. So you can leave it to do this automatically, and you don't need to keep looking at it. I forgot to mention this definition of text engineering at the top. So the best definition I could find was the discipline or act of engineering software systems to perform tasks involving processing human language. And this is the key difference between text engineering and text mining. So in text mining, as Richard described, you have to go through, in his case he mentioned 800 comments to try and get a sample example template to compare the new data against. But here, what you do is engineer the software at the start by developing a set of rules. So Richard said the algorithms were a black box, you couldn't change those rules, but in text engineering you write the rules at the start or modify the rules at the start. So that's the key difference. So how this is an example, or a very simplistic example of a rule. And so this rule would be able to return all the examples of university of city name. And as Don points out, it would exclude things like I went to university, which is a level of sophistication that text mining wouldn't do, says Don. So if that's wrong, you can't get me for that one. So as with Richard's approach with text mining, you end up with a cluster of related comments, and then you have to put the theme name onto them. So how are we going to set these rules? Well, we've started doing this, and first of all we've sent out a survey to all the different stakeholders, all the different people that we want to use the dashboard. So that's commissioners, it's clinicians, it's patients and carers and NHS managers. So we sent the survey out to all of these people, and we're asking them to help us set these rules by telling us the sorts of terms they use to talk about healthcare, the setting for healthcare staff, their conditions. And we can use the figures of speech and such like to sensitise our system. So these rules sit in something called a gazetteer, which will include rules about the syntax of language, but also it will have if you want, a vocabulary. So we're trying to add to that. And by sensitising the system at the start, this will help to make it more accurate, dedicated to healthcare purposes, and also the more that we can put in at the start, the more it's going to be able to predict where new unknown words can fit, which, as Richard explained, text mining doesn't really do very well. And we're also going to do a literature review to help to develop this work further, and we are going to use the work that Richard and his team have done already. We're not going to ignore that. So all that's going to help us to develop the new rules. And we've also set up social media and a website, and we hope we'll get feedback from that. And we're going to have a national launch on May the 5th, and we're going to run the work that we've developed at the workshops, so we'll get feedback from people actually using the prototype systems that we've developed. The dashboard, we're also developing a dashboard, as I said, and we're doing a similar scoping exercise around the dashboard with a literature review, asking people what they'd like from a dashboard, from our dashboard specifically, and what a dashboard in general should be like to be useful in healthcare. And so once we've done that, Dawn's going to bring everything together, and she's going to modify the GATE software and develop the dashboard prototypes. And once he's done that, it should be summer, and in summer the latest CPES free text comments are going to be released, and we're working closely with Insight and NHS England on this. And so the aim is for us then to process the CPES 2015 data through our new system, and we should get these clusters of comments coming out the other side. So you've got, for example, one cluster relating to all the comments talking about staff being good. As I said, we're trying to be pragmatic, and so we're incorporating normalisation process theory into our approach. So Kame is over there. So he held a seminar a month ago on normalisation process theory, and if you look at the constructs in normalisation process theory, they're geared around the implementation of a complex intervention into healthcare. So we're going to modify the terms slightly. So what we're looking at is current healthcare processes and how they're being done. So as an example, you might have a cluster of comments talking about staff needing training. And you can see this sub-construct skill set workability talks about whether the staff have training or not. And this is all in development, so the general idea is that Carl and his team have developed a toolkit of 16 questions, and they can use that toolkit to develop these little radar plots, which will indicate to each team where they've got deficits in their own organisation. And so we're going to have a link to that within the system, so they'll be able to run this little toolkit, find out where their deficits are, relate their deficits to the sorts of feedback comments that they're getting back on through this system, this process. And so from that they'll be able to make judgments about whether this is something that really needs to be changed because they're getting a lot of negative comments, or whether there are other comments that they have more resources to change immediately. So it's to help in the healthcare improvement decision-making process. And so Don has begun to develop a dashboard using existing text mining analysis to help him so far. So the example comments that you're seeing there are from the work that Richard and his team have done already. So in this example, you have the metric, the staff were good, and you can represent it as a dial, but that's quite static and not very helpful. So the idea is it's very interactive, and you can drill down, you can find out at the regional level what's going on. We might use a map, we might not, and you can find out at the local level. As this process gets used within NHS England, you can look year on year and compare, benchmark your performance against other teams. But importantly, you'll be able to go down to the individual text level. And I just use, so what Don says, very importantly, not only will we be able to extract the comments, but GATE marks them up, as you can see here, so that you can see exactly why that comment is in that cluster And as he points out, that verification process will give users confidence in the analysis that it's doing what they expect it to do and is sensitive enough. So at the start, the surveys and the feedback, we're calling that a form of co-design work because we're involving all the stakeholders who might use the dashboard and the analysis at the end. And we're continuing this. Once we've got the dashboard prototype, we're going to hold large focus groups, consensus groups. And these are going to be groups of 20 to 30 people who they're going to be a mixture of the different stakeholders all together, and by having them all together in the same room, which is a recognised process with concept mapping, consensus statement processes, they can negotiate solutions. So in this case, what they're going to negotiate is what our dashboard should look like. You can only have a limited number, say around 6 or so metrics on the top level of a dashboard. So they'll be able to reach consensus on what the important things should be that the dashboard should be showing and what it should look like. If we held them separately, the patients might suggest things that the NHS staff would say, well, they just simply don't have the resources to do anything about, for example. So that's very important to get them in the room together. Once we've done that and we've refined the dashboard, we're going to test it out with 15 NHS managers, and we're going to do this with another survey that Richard's currently leading on in Southampton. It's a multi-site study, the LAP-CD study, the Life After Prostate Cancer Diagnosis study. So we're going to take free text comments from that, run it through our text engineering process, feed the information into our dashboard, give it to these 15 managers, and we're going to ask them to walk through the process of using this system. And we also hope to do a health economics behaviour experiment where we get a number of managers to do choice experiments where they can choose the level of use that they put the application to. It's a choice preference study. So once we've done all that and further refined our information, our dashboard and our process, Insight NHS England have already promised us they're going to put a link from their website to our dashboard. We hope to do the same thing with the Care Quality Commission. We're developing a manual to explain to other people how to use the system, and also if they want to adapt it to a different type of health survey, how to adapt it. We're also going to provide the health economics report to help people make decisions about using our system. And this isn't something that we're aiming to do, this last point, which I've put an arrow to. So our analysis is going to do very basic level thematic analysis, literal themes of the sort that are very helpful to improve healthcare. But researchers in particular might want to develop more conceptual themes. And Richard has talked about, for instance, in the model that he's developed. So if researchers want to do a further layer of work, I believe that they could take the analysis that we're producing, not using the dashboard, but the raw analysis, the clusters of themes, as a first stage process so they can miss out some of this trawling through these thousands and thousands of comments. CPERS last year had over 70,000 comments, so it's a lot to trawl through. So it will take some of the donkey work out of their analysis so that they can get on to some of the more conceptual analysis. That's an idea. So in summary, we're developing a process, and it really is designed for healthcare service improvement rather than for a general thematic analysis approach. But it could be used for that. We do hope that it will compare well with the text mining and gold standard manual approaches that Rich has talked about, but it should have these tremendous speed advantages. It's not a black box. It will recognise novel terms because of the syntax and semantic processes that it can understand through these little task boxes. And as I said, we hope that it's transferable across surveys. Funded by the NIHR, Twitter feed, website, and the rest of the team. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carol. Again, if you could hold any pressing questions for the panel discussion at the end. So I'm delighted to welcome our invited speaker, Clive Seal, who is a medical sociologist and until recently was Professor at Brunel University, who's going to describe his work on analysing qualitative data using Wordsmith and WordStat.
Hi, well, thank you very much for inviting me along. I'm going to talk about my experience of computer-assisted text analysis. And I'm going to start you off by talking about my use of a piece of software, which is a very simple bit of software called Wordsmith Tools. Later, I'll go into the use of a different bit of software called WordStat, okay, which is made by a company called Provalis. But first of all, Wordsmith Tools. Wordsmith Tools is a bit of software that can be downloaded from the website on the internet, and you then email Mike Smith, who invented it, and you send him £60 and he sends you a key and it works. There's a free version called AntConc, if anyone's interested in playing with this software, AntConc, AntConc. If you just Google that, it's a Japanese university where there's an American, I think, or an English person working there who's made this beautiful bit of software. This is very similar to Wordsmith Tools, but you don't have to commit £60 to it. Okay, so it's pretty cheap. The Provalis software, WordStat, is much more expensive, but sort of en vivo levels of price, several £100s. But this is Wordsmith Tools, okay, and this is where I was probably 8 or 9 years ago when I had a data set which was basically people's messages written on internet forums. I was interested in studying the material that people had put on a prostate cancer site and a breast cancer site. A lot of them were people with prostate cancer or people with breast cancer, but sometimes they were relatives and friends of people with one of those cancers. So I was interested in comparing the kinds of language and experiences people with prostate cancer had compared with breast cancer. And as you can imagine, that's very much also about comparing men and women, because these diseases are largely specific, and in case of prostate cancer, wholly specific to one gender. So I had a lot of material. You can see in red there, I had nearly 1.4 million words of breast cancer text and 0.3 million words of prostate cancer text. And so that was really too much to read. And I think this is the main message one of the main messages of this talk, which is that this is an approach which is very suited to dealing with very large quantities of material. I have used it on smaller, more manageable data sets, but it's really well suited to large amounts of material. I think it provides an alternative, and perhaps in some cases a less analyst-influenced approach than conventional qualitative thematic analysis, where the analyst reads the material and exhaustively invents coding schemes which are then attached to chunks of text. And you use a piece of software like NVivo or MaxQDA to retrieve the relevant items that are related to a code. That's the sort of old way of doing things. I think this way is a much more rapid way of generating findings which are really very similar to conventional code and retrieve qualitative thematic analysis. So there I was with large amounts of text from these two websites, and what Wordsmith Tools does, first of all, and a lot of the slides I'm going to show you have got a lot of numbers in them, and you'll be pleased to know that for the vast majority of cases you can ignore almost all these numbers. Basically what this is showing you, and this is generated by Wordsmith Tools, if you just draw all the prostate cancer comments in and press a button within about 10 seconds, is it tells you which words are more common in the prostate cancer text compared to the breast cancer text. So you can see that the first word up there, this is quite good as a pointer, isn't it, is PSA, which stands for prostate-specific antigen. So you've got these guys typing messages to each other and saying, well, my PSA test was 2.3 yesterday and mine was 12.7, a month ago. I'm doing better or I'm doing worse. And PSA was used 1,164 times, which is 0.4% of all the words in the prostate cancer text. Okay? And it's saying that in the breast cancer text, which is the reference corpus, because I'm comparing the prostate with the breast cancer text, it only occurred once. So in all those 1.4 million words, someone somewhere writing about breast cancer, maybe it was someone who had a father or a partner who had prostate cancer and just mentioned PSA just the once. So PSA shows the biggest keenness. In other words, just in terms of pure statistical frequency, PSA is much more common in the prostate cancer text than the breast cancer text. Now, you'd expect this, wouldn't you? Okay, not exactly a finding. Okay, well, have a look at the coloured words there. You can see there's a blue word there which says regards, which is how people like to end their messages. And then there's 3 red texts, which are basically people words. So I've just categorized 4 words into 2 categories. Greetings and goodbye words, regards is one of those, and the red words are words that refer to people. So then I turned it upside down and did exactly the same for a comparison of breast cancer and prostate cancer. And if you look at the red-blue words there, you can see that there's a much greater range of red words. I, she, her, I'm, women, me, mum, they, my. Okay? So straight away you can see that women are much more likely to use a very wide range of people words compared to men. And when they use greetings words, they talk about love, and I've categorized X as a greeting word. Now X, of course, could have meant X-ray. Okay? And that's one of the things that people like to say when they look at word counting. They say, yes, but words have more than one meaning. You've got to look at the context of words. A lot of qualitative researchers say that. And that's absolutely true. You have to look at the phenomenon of lexical ambiguity, and you have to be willing to disambiguate words with more than one meaning. The word bank can mean financial bank or river bank. There's some words with lots of different meanings. Other words like brachytherapy or prostatectomy tend to have just one meaning. Okay? So there are words vary in how lexically ambiguous they are. But a word like X could mean X-ray. Okay? So in order to categorize it as a greetings word, which in fact it is, there are 1,085 instances of these, I was able, using the software, to look at a word in its context. Okay? And that's one of the facilities which all decent computer-assisted analysis of text software offers. This is a display, for example, of the word scan, which can be generated in Wordsmith tools, which allows you to see that the word scan is not I climbed the hill and scanned the horizon. It's actually to do with a medical diagnostic procedure, scanning, bone scan, CT scan, or whatever. So checking X, I was able to see that out of those 1,085 uses, only a couple were about X-rays, and the vast majority of them were kisses. Okay? Women like to end their messages with love and kisses. Men like to end their messages with regards. Okay, and that was and the materials. The software also allows you to look at 3-word phrases associated with a particular word, and all of that's in the aid of investigating each word that you're interested in order to look at the particular meaning it has in the particular group of texts that you're analysing. Once one has done that and made a list of the words that are more frequent in one text than another, it's possible to choose, for example, the top 200 words. The top 100 in the prostate cancer text and the top 100 in the breast cancer text, for example. That's roughly what's been done here. And they're all mixed up. Now, you saw that I had 1.6 or so million words. I now only have this many words to analyse. So this is one of the things that computer-assisted text analysis can do. It can reduce the amount of material so that you focus on the essential stuff. These are the words which are the key to really understanding, particularly, in this case, gender differences, because here I'm comparing gender here. Advanced, amazing, appointment, apt, which is appointment. I've looked at all of these. I didn't bother to look at brachytherapy, but I looked at others which might have had more than one meaning. And that's simply an alphabetical list of words which are either very common in the prostate text or very common in the breast text. And I was then able to categorize these words. And this is the point at which this form of computer-assisted analysis becomes a little bit like conventional qualitative thematic analysis. I'm assigning text to analyst-derived categories. Okay? So my categories were words like greetings words. So I included regards, thanks, hello, welcome, all the best, regs for regards. Support words, support, love, care, kisses and hugs, and so on. So these are like the code words that you generate when you're doing qualitative thematic analysis. There are internet words, www, website, forums, message boards, scroll. Research words, study, data, trial, funding, research. You can see that these words, I've looked at the meaning of them, and I've seen the majority of cases allow me to more or less safely categorize them in this way. So then what the software allows you to do is to compare prostate and breast. And what this shows is that support words are much more common in the breast cancer text than in the prostate cancer text. That feelings words, there's a much greater range of feelings and a rather different vocabulary in the breast cancer text compared to the prostate cancer text, where men are concerned and embarrassed, regards. And the breast cancer text, there's a huge range of much more kind of dramatic emotions going on. And in terms of people, you have a huge range of people. So you can use these kinds of brief summaries to hop to the original context in which these words are used to very rapidly portray gender differences in the way in which people experience illness. Excuse me, I'm just going to get a drink. So an analysis like that would probably take a day or two. Okay? So instead of reading 1 point whatever it was million words and exhaustively coding it, I can generate that sort of thing pretty rapidly. But you might be saying, well, gender differences, boring old topic, we all know this anyway, there's huge literature on language differences between men and women, and there's quite a well-established critique which says you shouldn't be looking for differences anyway. It's politically rather dodgy to be doing such a thing. And you end up with getting pretty obvious results. Everyone knows about gender differences in language. If you just have to read a few articles and you find that the newspapers are full of men are from Mars and women from Venus type articles. There were one or two findings that were a little bit unexpected. The knowledge and communication category, I wasn't expecting men to use the sort of vocabulary that they did compared to women who were using knowledge and communication words of a very different sort. But there weren't very big surprises in that particular bit of analysis. Where I found eventually with Wordsmith tools, the interesting things happened was where you chose more interesting comparisons. So with this data set, for example, there were some women, in fact half the women half the people on the prostate cancer board were actually women. There are a few more women posting on the prostate cancer board than men. Women can't get prostate cancer, lucky them, they had relatives and friends and fathers and partners who were experiencing prostate cancer. On the breast cancer board, there were a few men too. There were 4 men with breast cancer, but there were also partners and sons of women with breast cancer. And comparing them with women elsewhere started to generate slightly more interesting results. The women on the prostate forum were characterized by words like welcome, thank you, and hello. They were operating as the sort of hostesses smoothing over flame wars between men, welcoming new people, generally trying to keep the interaction going in a cooperative way. So they were performing that function which men were not performing to the same extent. And then there were men on the breast cancer forum whose language really was very close to that of women on either forum and very different from the men on the prostate cancer forum. They were, when I looked in detail at the 54 men who were on the breast cancer forum, they tended to be people who had experienced or were facing loss and who, in many cases, once you looked at their language and drilled down into the actual language they were using and what they were saying, were experiencing a kind of gender transformation. Some of them became quite boringly proselytizing as a result. But maybe I'm being too critical of these guys. They were discovering their feminine sides, as one of them said. I'm not the greatest person at talking about feelings. It may take a while to get going, try to be positive. In fact, he's actually telling a woman who had a problem with her husband that she ought to be talking more about feelings. I mean, well, anyway, you try to be positive, but it's difficult to be like that all the time. You can run out of positive things. All you've got to do is give her a hug. Oh, hang on, he's giving advice to another man. All you've got to do is give her a hug. Being male, I don't always know when hugs are required, of course, and then I feel guilty. So his language is starting to involve more of the language of feelings, and this was very characteristic of these men, okay? So that was where I got to after my first foray into computer-assisted text analysis. You can see that it's fairly kind of simple, and I started to think, well, finding interesting comparison groups might be a way of generating slightly more interesting findings. And that got written up. The first article was very much about the method and looked at gender differences, and the second article was very much about what happened to women and men when they entered spaces that were largely inhabited by the opposite gender. What happened to their language? And so that was what that second one was about. And then I made a few preliminary conclusions. I felt that this gave a kind of aerial view of the landscape that allowed me to see features that were hard to detect from ground level, as it were, using a kind of metaphor from aerial archaeology, where people fly over a landscape in a drought and they can see crop circles on the ground. Doing this kind of analysis, you're not on the ground, you're not reading the actual material, but you get a sense of what might be interesting to descend and look at. So the patterns made me think, oh, well, the men on the breast cancer forum are the ones to look at. So instead of reading all 1.7 million words, I looked at the 54 or so men on that particular forum. So I started detecting features that couldn't be seen from ground level without a huge amount of work. I feel it's more likely to be reliable than conventional qualitative analysis because you delay inference. You're forced to respect what the computer throws up at you before you then categorize it into the semantic groups or the coding categories. I don't feel it's a quantitative method. I mean, there's a lot of numbers involved, but ultimately what you're interested in is getting the representative stories that give you an insight into the lives and the meanings that are being constructed by the people that have written the text. You can certainly deal with very much larger data sets than is feasible with conventional code and retrieve approaches. But it's got some problems. Firstly, it's good for comparative research, but it tends to overemphasize differences and doesn't focus very much on things which make people similar. There's a lot of ways in which men and women's language is similar, not just the differences. And also, if you choose dull comparison pairs, you'll get dull results. You need to choose interesting comparison pairs. And you can only deal with 2 sets of text at a time. So it was sort of interesting but limited. Now I went on, and I'm going to whiz over this bit, to apply this method in a whole range of different studies, making different kinds of comparisons. And I had the opportunity to get a very large archive of qualitative interview transcripts from Health Talk Online. And there, the literature on gender and language is largely based on very small qualitative samples. There's not much trying to, for example, look at gender differences in relation to how social class interacts with that, or how age interacts with that. You know, it may be that older women and older men are different from younger women and younger men in terms of gender differences, or social class or social position may influence things. So it was possible to make comparison groups. I'm just going to, I don't need you to read all of this, but basically to make 4 comparison groups in this case of men and women, but also divided according to social class by splitting the interviews into 4 equally similar groups in terms of illness, 4 groups of 24, whereby I could look at, cross-cutting the variables of both gender and social class. And this was unusual in the literature because the vast majority of gender and language just looks at gender as if it's a single variable. In this study, and again, I don't want to get into the detail of this study, I was able to see how higher social class men, they were actually very flexible in their use of language and could at will adopt a more feminine way of speech, whereas low SEC men were much more rigid in their vocabulary and didn't vary very much. So there were lots of ways in which class affected the gender issues that were involved. So I'm going to kind of whiz over that because I want to get on to the word stat. But this secondary analysis allowed me to do quite a lot of studies using wordsmith tools which generated various reports. Okay, and also finally, just down at the bottom there is a study where the material being analysed was journal articles. And this is actually a very good way of, you can actually retrieve journal abstracts, journal titles, or even the whole body of journals, journal articles text, and analyse these very rapidly, dealing with millions of words, and characterise whole groups of articles according to which country they're in, which journal they're in, what topic they're covering, and you can do a survey of an intellectual field in this way. And that's what I did in the mapping of the field article. But I don't want to get into too much detail with that, because what I really want to do is move on to describing WordStat. Now, WordStat, actually, I know we're supposed to be delaying. I've whizzed through that very quickly. Has anyone got any burning questions of understanding that you want to ask while I take a sip? Okay, so the concept of listing words, looking at lexical ambiguity to try and rule that out, then coding a small number of keywords to get at key differences between texts, choosing interesting comparison groups. Basically, you can get a long way just doing that. I must have published, 9 or 10 journal articles of findings based just on wordsmith tools. WordStat is a much more sophisticated bit of software, and this is a study which I haven't published. I'll show you two studies in the time I've got. The first one is this study of representations of assisted dying in British newspapers. In fact, since 1890, but anyway, I took a cut-off point of 1930. If you look at the literature on how the mass media has treated the topic of euthanasia and assisted dying, there's lots of, it's a bit like the gender and language literature, there's lots of small, largely qualitative, code and retrieve type studies. Like you'll find some American journal publishes something on how the Jack Kevorkian story has been covered in the American press, or how British newspapers or British television has covered the Diane Pretty story, okay, which was a famous case which moved the law on in terms of assisted dying a few years ago in Britain. Or indeed how the Tony Bland persistent vegetative case was covered in British newspapers, or how Nancy Cruz, I forget her name, but various persistent vegetative state cases were covered in the American press. So you'll get studies which focus on particular stories, or on just, say, a couple of years of coverage. What this study did, because of the power of computer-assisted qualitative data analysis, or computer-assisted text analysis, is to take the whole of British press coverage since it started on this topic. Okay, that was the ambition. Now, actually, I ended up largely focusing on 4 or 5 newspapers plus the British Medical Journal. But in terms of scope, this was a far more ambitious and wide-ranging study than anything that had been published in the literature. And this is really what I want to convey to you, that this approach to analysing text allows for much more ambitious studies than these funny little qualitative studies that everyone's doing all over the place, with code and retrieve and reading all the stuff and trying to exhaustively, mark up the meaning. This really allows you to do something big, okay? So I'm a bit of a missionary for this method. All right, but I haven't published this study, so, you've got to get to that point, Anyway, so WordStat, representations of assisted dying, okay? So you can get newspaper articles from Nexus. I guess Southampton University will have a subscription to this. Going back quite a long way. I think The Guardian started getting deposited in Nexus in 1984, and The Times as well. The Sun only started in the year 2000. So a lot of it's electronically available. You can also get The Times, The Observer, and now the Daily Mail on PDF files that are not searchable. And I luckily had a small amount of money, and I paid some very willing teenagers to read in ancient articles which they actually found fascinating, reading in these 1930s articles on euthanasia and assisted dying, into a computer, so to turn it, using voice software to recognize their speech, to turn it into searchable text. And in that way, it was possible to build up a collection of 1,051 Guardian articles, 810 Mail and Mail on Sunday articles, Times, Observer and BMJ. So quite a lot of material going all the way back to the 1890s, representing the retrieve, these were the search terms, and so that's what these search terms retrieved. This many articles. There's a little display showing that it went all the way back to 1800, where those words were used in some articles. But really, it was only in the 1930s the Voluntary Euthanasia Legalization Society was founded in 1935. Associated with an attempt to legalize euthanasia in Parliament, which was defeated, like they all have been. And it was only really in the 1930s that the modern language of euthanasia and assisted dying started being used. And before that, the word euthanasia was being used in a slightly different way. So I decided not to go that far back. You can see that there's a dip in the 1940s, largely because during wartime, people parked that concern in the interest of killing enemies rather than anyway, it was a different kind of killing going on. So the interest waned. And this is really just the same display showing changes over time, but by each of these different newspapers and the BMJ. So that's just the kind of describing the sample. Okay? Right, this is something to focus on a little bit. What WordSearch does, first is you kind of draw these articles into it, and it will then make a list of all the words in those articles, just the same way in which Wordsmith Tools does. So say you've got 1 million words, it'll simply list them, either alphabetically or in terms of which ones occur most frequently, down to the ones that just occur once. Okay, it'll make that list very, very rapidly. You can also make a list of 2-word phrases, or a list of 3-word phrases, or 4-word or 5-word. Okay. And it's possible to then click a little button and it will then list either these words or these phrases, depending on what you're looking at, in descending order of something which it calls the TF-IDF score. A TF-IDF score, I have no idea what it stands for and I don't care. Okay? What it is, it's a measure that identifies words or phrases that happen quite a lot. I mean, there are some words that happen quite a lot in text, like a or the. But they're not very important words. What you want is words that happen quite a lot, not rare words, but occur more in some documents than others. Okay, and the TF-IDF score just uses a little bit of brain, little bit of mathematical brain, to generate the words that occur pretty often in your corpus, in your collection, but distinguish between documents that occur a lot in some documents but never at all in others. Okay, so that's the first thing, and that actually identifies the words that are going to be the key phrases and words that you use to really crack open the text and begin to understand what's going on in it. So I took usually the first 300 words and phrases. I mean, you can take the first 200, whatever, it doesn't really matter. But you try and take the first X words and phrases and look at them in context. There are some which will be lexically ambiguous. Okay, and you need to do something about that, maybe not include them in the analysis. When you're starting to deal with 2-word phrases and 3-word phrases, the lexical ambiguity problem begins to reduce. Okay, when you're dealing with a word like X, it might mean a lot of things. But when you're dealing with or a word like assisted, it could mean a lot of things. But if you're dealing with a word like a term like assisted suicide, it's not very lexically ambiguous. Okay. So those with consistently singular meanings, you can put them into a dictionary. And this is what this software does. You can build up a dictionary that's specific to the texts that you're analysing, whose categories group together words with semantic similarity. And you can also use a thesaurus function. So if you've got a word like assisted, you can find all the words which the thesaurus tells you are in the text but have similar meanings. You can decide whether to include them in your dictionary. And then you begin to look at the way in which dictionary categories are distributed over different groups, like compare the BMJ with newspapers, or look at the 1960s compared to the 1930s, look at trends over time. Now that's quite a rapid explanation of the method, but you'll see it working as I go along. This is a list of 2-word phrases, and that's the TF-IDF score, which tells you that the term assisted suicide is the 2-word phrase that occurs very frequently but distinguishes between documents. And although I didn't know it when I first saw this, I now know that that is because assisted suicide has become the terminology to refer to assisted dying nowadays. No one really talks about euthanasia anymore, okay? Because euthanasia doesn't work as a cause for people who want to legalise assisted dying. But assisted suicide, it was thought until the recent vote in the House of Commons, which defeated the attempt to legalise assisted suicide, it was thought that that would have a greater chance of being publicly acceptable. So the language has shifted in recent years. And the term assisted dying is also something which has come about more recently. But something like mercy killing, you don't hear about mercy killing very much now, compared to, for example, the 1950s, when it was used a lot. So these are words which I now know vary quite a lot over time. And this is the same with just individual words. The word suicide and the word assisted, you can see why. They would be high up in the TF-IDF score because they're part of the phrase assisted suicide. Okay, so you can then look at, use the thesaurus facility to look for synonyms to assisted in case that you want to include them in your dictionary, as well as a whole lot of other words. And you can also look at words in their context. So that looks at the word assisted in case you're wondering what they're assisting with, so that you can look at it in context before you include it in your dictionary. Okay? I actually would include assisted suicide in the dictionary, but not the word assisted, because in fact assisting can be assisting in all sorts of things. And these are examples of dictionary categories. Okay, the one on the left, Nazi, Auschwitz, concentration camp, Dachau, death camp, genocide, Hitler, Holocaust. I mean, less well known are words like Limburg, Severing, Heffelmann, Burley, Boner. But these are words that are associated when you look at the use of these words with reference to stories about Nazi euthanasia. Another dictionary category is persistent vegetative state and the withdrawal of treatment, where Nancy Cruzan, feeding tube, Hillsborough, Mr. Bland, Tony Bland, paralysed from the neck, PVS, persistent vegetative state, Terry Schiavo, Karen Quinlan, Tony Bland, vegetative state. You can see that all of those phrases and words belong to the category PVS and withdrawing treatment. Eugenics, breed a strong and vigorous race, breed successfully with each other. So you can see that it's not just 2-word or 3-word phrases, you can look at 4-word phrases, 5-word. Breeding of degenerate hordes, breeding reckless. I find this astonishing, but anyway, these are all words that are in the corpus and were very much accepted ways of talking, although often criticised in the 1930s. Mentally abnormal, mentally defected. Martin Amis. What could he be doing there? We'll find out later. So those are examples of 3 dictionary categories. And this is a list of all the dictionary categories that came out of this analysis. But by this stage, I was probably, when preparing the data took a little bit of time because of reading in the material. But after that had been done, I suspect I was at this stage about a week into the analysis. Okay? This is a list of all the dictionary categories. I've shown you the contents of Nazi and of PVS and withdrawing treatment and one of the others just now, eugenics. Okay? But there were other dictionary categories as well, which sprang out of this the IDF thing. Okay, the most frequent distinguishing words. And so it was possible, I mean, these are basically like qualitative thematic coding categories. And it's then possible to use the software, and again, hundreds of numbers, but let's not worry too much about that. But if you take the first one, assisted suicide, you can see that this occurred just once in 1920, 3 times in 1960, and in the 2000 to 2009, it was 3,041. I actually stopped collecting data at 2013, so if I'd gone on for the whole decade, no doubt I'll have more than 3,000. So this is a word that's increased over time, and other terms have decreased over time. The software also allows you to, it's a bit hard to see this, I'm afraid, but it allows you to map this out. In fact, there's a better diagram later that I'll show you that makes this a bit easier to see. So I'll skip over these diagrams. This is a table which shows categories that have gone down over time. People don't use the language of Christianity in the context of euthanasia debates very much anymore. People don't talk about voluntary euthanasia, and eugenics is a very stigmatized way of talking in newspapers. It was popular in the 1940s, the 1950s, but now it is used, and we'll see an example of it later, but it's very rarely used. There's categories that are rising over time. What's the language like these days? Well, it's very much about right to die, people worried about vulnerable people and slipping down the slippery slope if you legalize assisted dying, about wishing and wanting things, about the role that palliative care can play, sometimes instead of assisted dying, the language of human rights, and as I've said before, the term assisted suicide rather than euthanasia. And these are all much more frequent in later years. Okay? So you can see that what this software allows you to do is to generate a dictionary, to track changes over time, or indeed look at differences between the BMJ and other newspapers. I won't show you that analysis, I haven't really done it yet, but just to allow you to see that this is also a qualitative method. Let's just, for example, think, well, I've got this data set, I've analysed it in this way, and I've noticed that eugenicist arguments have declined over time. I'm going to write a paper on the way in which eugenicist arguments have woven their way in and out of this debate in the newspapers about assisted suicide or euthanasia. What did that argument look like in the 1930s? Well, you can see here, when the software allows you to dive straight in and get a representative quote. When we see the hideous monsters that are kept alive and nursed by trained people, are we inclined to ask, can civilization devise no method of dealing with them? And then he talks about natural selection. So this is the Deputy Medical Officer for Health in West Ham in 1935. And you can see that this, if you've talked about breeding a strong and vigorous race now, it really is not an acceptable way of thinking in the way that it was in Britain in the 1930s and in many European countries. But because of the experience of Nazi euthanasia and the disgust and horror that resulted in, it became very, very difficult to pursue a eugenicist argument about euthanasia after the war, although some people still did. Okay, this is in the 1960s, again a medical officer for health, but it's much more restrained. Okay, we need to start planning now for the growing number of old people in society who are already swamping the health and welfare services in areas like his own. He was not advocating euthanasia. Okay, so he's trying to distance himself from that. But he did suggest that people beyond a certain age should not be kept alive by medical ingenuity, but simply offered nursing care until they died. And of course, the journalist feels the need for balance, and so quotes from a Help the Aged spokesman who reacts with horror and revulsion. So you may ask, what do eugenicist arguments look like now? Okay, well, that's where Martin Amis comes in. Okay? The novelist Martin Amis in 2010 suggested euthanasia booths should be set up in the streets so that old people who become a burden on society could end their lives with a martini and a medal and avoid civil war between the generations. So basically this is a sort of maverick character who's possibly trying to get a bit of publicity to himself, who's sort of bad boy of English literature, coming out with material that he knows is offensive, but a little bit like Donald Trump, or maybe sometimes Boris, gets a lot of attention for saying something scandalous. So eugenicist arguments really are ruled out of court in this debate nowadays compared to the others. So you can see how this kind of analysis can zero in on particular topics. You could look at the rise and fall of Christian arguments in the debate, or and get representative quotes and so on. Okay, well, I'm going to move on. I'm going to very briefly, because I know probably only take 5 more minutes, because I know we're going to have a little panel discussion in a minute, just show you some quotes from a study of the use of sedation in end-of-life care, comparing 3 different countries. In the Netherlands and Belgium, euthanasia is legal. In the UK, it's not. And the use of sedative drugs with people who are dying is controversial ethically, because if you sedate someone completely to the point of unconsciousness and they never wake up, in some respects you could say that that's a form of soft euthanasia. You're removing their experience of living and they never recover it. Okay? But if you use sedative drugs in a way which you later lift the drugs and they come back into consciousness, or you don't sedate people to that extent so that they're simply subdued and no longer anxious and agitated, then that's rather distant from the idea of sedation as soft euthanasia. Now, what this study was trying to do through interviews with doctors, nurses and relatives in these 3 countries, and the Belgian and Dutch material was translated into English, was to compare practices in these 3 countries through second-hand accounts derived from interviews with the clinicians, working in different kinds of settings. And I'm actually going to whiz over the analysis, which was a WordStat analysis, and take you straight to 2 quotes. This is a Belgian nurse. He was ready to go. The bold terms are terms which were in dictionary categories used to select this quote. He was finished. He was physically finished. He'd been able to say goodbye to everyone properly. All the children came, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, all of them. Able to say goodbye. Took him a week to get up the courage to do it. He said goodbye to everyone in the run-up to that discussion with the doctor. On the day the sedation started, he again said goodbye. He'd had enough. The doctor gave dormicum, which is the Belgian word for midazolam, and he fell asleep very quickly. We immediately attached the pump. He went to sleep. Didn't wake up again. Okay? Now, that, I don't know if you've ever been able to bear it, but you may perhaps have seen the occasional televised euthanasia event in Holland. From time to time on the television, people, there are these very serious programs that appear on the television where people have euthanasia and they're surrounded by their relatives and they say goodbye and people are crying and an injection is given and the person sort of slumps over and is dead. And it's very much a kind of goodbye scene. Okay? Well, that's what this feels like, isn't it? That's just what this is like. He's saying goodbye. He knows he's not going to wake up again. But this isn't a lethal injection. This is an injection of a sedative drug. Okay? I'm going to skip over the Dutch one, which is very similar, but compare that to the British one. He was a gentleman who'd been struggling with periods of agitation. The staff were trying to manage his agitation. He wasn't settled. He was quite distressed. He's a dying man who's terminally agitated, very distressed, terminal agitation, very classical when you see it. There weren't any other treatment options. We needed to give him something to help him relax a little bit, to relieve his distress. So they gave him midazolam, which did settle him. You accept that. In order to relieve someone's agitation, you may make them more sleepy. My intention was not to sedate him, but to use appropriate levels of medication, titrated. He was still awake, he was still aware. You're trying to relieve distress, settle them, not hasten their demise, relieve symptoms. The doses weren't inappropriate. They'd been titrated. He was calmer and died more peacefully. So in Britain, the typical narrative was sedation is a treatment where you're trying to maintain consciousness for as long as possible, but it's a response to the symptoms, particularly a symptom which was generally called terminal agitation, but also other symptoms too. Whereas in Belgium and Holland, not in all cases, but much more typically, it was an alternative to euthanasia. And in fact, the Dutch quote shows the doctor saying, well, unlike euthanasia, where you've got to get the agreement of another doctor 2 weeks beforehand and have a persistent request and fill in all sorts of forms, with dormicum, you can just give it to them. Okay? So you don't have all the bureaucracy. So it is a form of soft euthanasia in some cases. And the words that these are the dictionary categories which were formed using WordStat. Number 1 is Britain. Number 3 and 2 are, I can't remember which is which, but one's Belgium and one's Holland. And this, think of these like magnets. If number 1 is a British magnet, it's pulling phrases and words that were associated with semi-consciousness, agitation and distress. Trying, you remember the nurse was trying to do this, is the whole vocabulary of trying to control the symptoms. Settled and comfortable, dosage, proportionality, remember the word titration. So all of these words are typical of British ways of talking about this, whereas words like unable to continue, saying goodbye, and a moment was reached when he couldn't take any more. So that reaching this moment, there were lots of vocabulary suggesting that. So those quotes were chosen after doing the WordStat analysis that I've described in the use of the euthanasia study, the newspaper text study, in order to generate a qualitative account of differences. So my conclusion is that these kinds of softwares allow relatively objective descriptions of the main themes of very large amounts of text. And I think they're superior to coding and retrieval approaches for identifying themes, because you don't have to do so much work. They give a picture that's less biased by the investigator's personal preferences, because sometimes you can get attracted by a particular quote and think that it's much more widespread than it really is. Well, the computer doesn't let you do that. They enable interesting comparisons between groups of text to be made, and I think this is both a qualitative and a quantitative way of approaching text that isn't, there's a genuinely hybrid form. Okay? That's it. Okay?